What happens when the CEO gets hired at his own restaurant and discovers the dark secrets of the world he built? Michael Carter had built Carter's Grill and Dine from the ground up, a modest restaurant that blossomed into a national chain known for its warm smiles and hearty meals. Yet today, as he sat in his sleek high-rise office reviewing endless complaints, he felt a sinking dread. The glowing profit charts and impressive quarterly reports masked a hidden rot, whispered grievances about overworked employees, curt customer interactions, and a management style that was slowly, insidiously choking the soul of his company. Late into the night, Michael pored over emails filled with words like rude, exhausted, and toxic. Every message, every anonymous note on a company forum, painted a picture that contrasted sharply with the image he had once proudly displayed. It wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was the shattered reality of the very people who powered his success. In that moment, with a heavy heart and a mind brimming with questions, Michael made a decision. No report or second-hand account could reveal the truth. He needed to see it himself. "I must go undercover," he murmured to the silent room, his voice low yet resolute. That decision marked the beginning of a journey that would force him to abandon his polished boardroom persona. The next evening, in the quiet intimacy of his modest apartment, Michael stared at his reflection in the mirror. He removed the crisp, tailored suit that had been his armor in board meetings and slid into a faded, plain uniform, just like the one his entry-level employees wore every day. With deliberate care, he placed a worn baseball cap on his head and adjusted a pair of thick-rimmed glasses to conceal his familiar eyes. In the dim light, his face transformed from the confident CEO known to the world into Mike Carter, an ordinary worker, blending into the background, ready to experience life on the restaurant floor. The transformation was symbolic. As he examined his altered appearance, a mix of apprehension and determination stirred within him. He realized that for the first time in years, he would not be shielded by titles or polished exteriors. Tonight, he would walk the same weary path as those who had silently suffered for too long. Packing a small duffel bag with nothing more than a change of clothes and a notepad, Michael stepped out into the cool night, leaving behind the familiar comforts of his corporate world. The following morning, the suburban Carter's Grill stood before him, a location chosen not for its glamour, but for the whispers of discontent that had been attached to its name. The building, with its faded sign and bustling parking lot, was a far cry from the gleaming flagship restaurants that once symbolized his dream. The aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee met him at the door, but underneath lay a tension that no amount of seasoning could mask. Michael walked through the glass door, his steps measured and his senses heightened. The interior was busy. Customers trickled in and out, their faces marked by impatience and resignation rather than the cheerful greetings he once expected. As he stepped into the chaos, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for the day ahead. At the counter, a young woman named Sarah was juggling multiple tasks with a strained smile. Barely out of her teens, her eyes betrayed a fatigue that went far deeper than a long shift could cause. Without pausing to acknowledge him, she mechanically greeted the next customer, her voice carrying a tired politeness that bordered on exhaustion. Michael's heart ached at the sight. "Hi there," he said in a friendly, unassuming tone. "I'm Mike, the new hire starting today." For a brief moment, Sarah's surprise flickered across her face before she quickly recovered and offered a polite smile. "Oh, welcome, I'm Sarah, let me show you around." Her voice was gentle, though a shadow of worry crept in as she glanced toward the back of the restaurant. As Sarah led Michael past a bulletin board cluttered with sticky notes and handwritten memos, his eyes caught fragments of the hidden stories, complaints about missed breaks, unfair shifts, and managers who never listen. Each note was a silent cry for help, a testament to the suffering that had been allowed to fester behind the smiles and bright lights of Carter's Grill and Dine. In the midst of the morning rush, the restaurant pulsed with a frenetic energy. Michael observed the organized chaos with a heavy heart. In the kitchen, clanging pans and shouted orders intermingled with the occasional groan of a worker under strain. He watched as Luis, a seasoned cook whose hands bore the marks of years of hard work, winced as he hastily wrapped a burn on his hand. There was no first aid kit in sight, and when a co-worker mentioned it in passing, the response was a shrug and a resigned sigh. This was not the caring environment Michael had envisioned when he set out to create a haven for both customers and employees. Then came the moment that seared itself into Michael's memory. An elderly woman, frail and careful, in her movements, stepped up to the counter with a small basket of groceries. She fumbled with her purse, counting out her coins with trembling fingers. The sight of her vulnerability should have inspired compassion. Instead, it drew a sneer from Rick, the store manager, known for his perpetually disapproving scowl. With a dismissive roll of his eyes, Rick muttered loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Here we go again. These old folks always slow everything down." The woman's face crumpled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she mumbled an apology, hastily retreating from the counter. Michael's pulse raced, a storm of anger and sorrow rising within him. This wasn't just a bad day. It was a systemic failure, a betrayal of everything he had worked for. The man who was supposed to embody the company's values was instead crushing the very spirit of his employees and customers. Throughout the morning, Michael continued his shift with a heavy heart, absorbing every detail. He helped refill napkin dispensers, cleared tables with a quiet efficiency, and observed each interaction with a keen, pained interest. Every whispered complaint in the break room, every forced smile, every hurried exchange became a piece of a larger, disturbing puzzle. In one quiet corner, he managed to jot down snippets of conversations. "They cut my hours again," whispered one disillusioned employee, while another murmured about being overlooked time and again. Sarah, in particular, left a deep impression on him. Despite the relentless pressure and the constant barrage of demeaning remarks from Rick, she persisted with a grace that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. Michael watched as she patiently dealt with a frustrated customer, apologizing for mistakes that were clearly not her fault. Each time Rick barked out a curt, biting comment, Sarah's face would tighten, yet she never let her frustration spill over into cruelty. It was a quiet resilience that spoke volumes about the strength of her character and the cost of working under such oppressive conditions. As the shift wore on, the restaurant's early bustle began to ebb into a subdued, weary rhythm. Michael found a moment of respite behind the counter, where he pulled out his notepad and carefully reviewed his observations. Each note was a testament to the everyday struggles of the people who had become the lifeblood of Carter's Grill and Dine. The whispers of discontent, the palpable fatigue, and the small yet significant moments of kindness amidst the chaos, all painted a picture of a company in desperate need of change. Stepping outside for a brief moment, Michael leaned against the doorframe of the restaurant, letting the cool morning air wash over him. He scrolled through internal messages on his phone, texts and emails from employees detailing their frustrations, their pleas for a little more understanding, a little more fairness. Every message was a painful reminder of the gap between the image he had carefully crafted and the reality that now lay before him. In that quiet moment, with the soft hum of the city in the background, Michael made a silent vow. He knew that this day was only the beginning, a spark that could ignite the long overdue change he desperately needed to implement. Tomorrow, he thought, I won't be a silent observer. I'll be the catalyst for the transformation this company deserves. The resolve in his heart burned brighter than any fear of the unknown. Returning inside, Michael resumed his role as Mike with a newfound determination. Every task he performed, whether it was stocking shelves, wiping down tables, or simply sharing a brief empathetic smile with a coworker, was now charged with a sense of urgency. He was no longer merely an undercover observer. He was a man on a mission to restore dignity and respect to a company that had lost its way. By the time the final customers trickled out and the hectic pace of the morning began to subside, Michael's day had been a whirlwind of observations and quiet heartbreaks. The energy in the restaurant was subdued. its vibrant spirit dimmed by exhaustion and neglect. Yet, as he collected his belongings at the end of his shift, there was a glimmer of hope that shone through, a hope that he could still make things right. Walking out into the bright light of day, Michael paused to look back at the restaurant's facade. The faded sign of Carter's Grill and Dine, once a beacon of promise, now stood as a silent witness to the hidden struggles within. His mind churned with the weight of what he had seen, the faces of his employees etched indelibly in his memory. Sarah's tired smile, Luis's silent pain, and the harsh words of Rick all converged into a stark reminder. The time for change had long passed. As Michael stepped away from the building, the promise of tomorrow stirred within him. The experiences of this single shift had opened his eyes to a reality that he could no longer ignore. A reality where every person in his company deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with the utmost respect. Today had been a harsh lesson in the cost of complacency, but it was also the beginning of a long-awaited awakening. With each step toward his car, Michael Carter felt a resolute determination welling up inside him. He knew that the journey to reclaim the soul of Carter's Grill and Dine would be challenging, that it would require difficult decisions and heartfelt confrontations. But as he drove away, leaving the restaurant behind, he carried with him the undeniable truth that every shift, every whispered complaint, and every tear shed by a hard-working employee was a call to action, a call he could no longer ignore. In that moment, Michael vowed that nothing would remain the same. Tomorrow he would return, not as the silent observer Mike, but as Michael Carter, the CEO committed to restoring the heart and integrity of the very company he had built. The day had been long and filled with harsh truths, but it had also lit a spark of transformation, a spark that promised a future where every employee, every customer, and every moment of service would finally be cherished as it was meant to. Be Michael's morning as Mike was only the beginning of a day that would expose the raw, unvarnished truth behind Carter's Grill and Dine. As the clock ticked past mid-morning, the restaurant's chaotic energy transformed into a relentless, exhausting rhythm. Michael trudged through the bustle, his senses heightened by every shouted command and every whispered complaint that slipped past the din of orders and clattering dishes. In the cramped kitchen, where the aroma of sizzling food mingled with the sting of overheated oil, he witnessed a scene that would haunt him. Luis, the veteran cook with hands roughened by years of tireless labor, winced as he hastily wrapped a burn on his hand with a faded cloth. There was no first aid kit in sight, no one to offer a word of concern. Instead, Rick, the store manager, appeared at the doorway with a scowl and a dismissive wave. "Luis, quit your whining and get back to work," Rick barked, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Luis gritted his teeth and returned to chopping vegetables, his silence speaking volumes about the resigned pain he carried every day. Meanwhile, at the counter, Sarah worked with an efficiency that bordered on exhaustion. Every time Rick passed by, she would shrink back as if bracing herself for the next verbal lash. Michael saw her face tighten with each passing remark, her eyes flickering with suppressed emotion. It was as if every customer interaction was a battle fought with a weary heart, each smile a fragile mask barely concealing the strain underneath. A few minutes later, a customer, a middle-aged man with a thick accent, stepped up to the counter. His order was simple, yet his tone was curt. "I need extra sauce on my burger," he said, not so much as a request as a demand. Before Sarah could respond, Rick stepped in. "Extra sauce? You've got plenty of it," Rick snapped, his words laced with impatience. He glared at the man, as if he were the one at fault for inconveniencing the entire team. The customer, taken aback, mumbled an apology and hurried away, leaving Sarah's eyes welling up for a split second before she blinked them away and forced a smile. Michael's heart pounded. He scribbled another note in his pad. "Manager's dismissive attitude alienates customers. Staff forced to apologize for shortcomings not of their making." Each incident, no matter how small, was a thread in the tapestry of neglect that had crept into his company's core. The lunch rush surged in with a chaotic force. The restaurant became a blur of orders, clattering trays, and overlapping conversations. Michael found himself juggling tasks, refilling napkins, wiping down counters, and even lending a hand at the drive-through window. In between, he stole glances at the staff, absorbing every detail. The employees' tired eyes, the way some of them exchanged quiet words in hushed tones, and the ever-present anxiety that hung over them like a shadow. In a brief lull, Michael made his way to the staff break area. It was a cramped space, dimly lit and cluttered with worn-out chairs. Here, away from the incessant hum of the front-of-house chaos, he overheard snippets of conversation that made his blood run cold. "I can't believe they keep cutting my hours again," whispered one employee as he stirred his lukewarm coffee. "They say if you're not smiling enough, they'll find someone who will," murmured another, voice barely audible. "And Rick, he doesn't care if you collapse on the floor. He just wants the numbers," added a third, the words heavy. With resignation, Michael's stomach churned. These weren't isolated gripes. They were a chorus of voices, each note a testament to a culture that had lost its humanity. As he stood there, hidden in the shadowed corner, he realized that this was the reality his employees endured every day. It was no longer about a few bad moments. It was a systemic failure of leadership, an erosion of values that once defined Carter's Grill and Dine. Determined to document everything, Michael discreetly recorded the murmurs in his notepad, every whispered complaint reinforcing his growing conviction that something had to change. Yet, as he continued his shift, another incident unfolded that pushed him even further toward the edge. In the midst of the frenetic pace, Sarah was handling a particularly difficult order when disaster struck. A tray of food, piled high with plates and cups, slipped from her grasp. The clatter of breaking dishes filled the air, drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. Sarah's face drained of color as she frantically attempted to gather the scattered items. Before she could even begin to recover, Rick stormed over, his eyes ablaze with fury. "What is it now? Can't you do anything right?" Rick bellowed, his voice so loud it seemed to silence the room. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to apologize. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up right away." Rick's response was cold and unyielding. "Sorry isn't good enough. You're lucky you even have a job here. If you can't handle it, maybe you should just leave." His words sliced through the air like a razor, leaving a palpable silence in their wake. The humiliation on Sarah's face was unmistakable, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she knelt to start cleaning up the mess. Michael's heart ached as he watched the scene unfold. Here was a young woman, barely out of her teens, who had come to work every day with hope and dedication, only to be met with relentless cruelty. In that moment, the weight of his decision to go undercover pressed down on him even more heavily. Every harsh word from Rick, every unjust reprimand, was a stark reminder that the soul of his company was in peril. As the day wore on, Michael's undercover identity allowed him to slip into the background, yet his awareness remained sharp. He noted the subtle shifts in the staff's demeanor, how some exchanged sympathetic looks when Rick passed by, how others kept their heads down and avoided eye contact. Even the customers seemed to sense the tension. What might have once been a pleasant dining experience now carried an undercurrent of discomfort and unease. During a brief lull between orders, Michael found himself at the side of the counter, where Luis was quietly tending to a small cut on his hand. "Luis, are you okay?" Michael asked softly, his tone laced with genuine concern. Luis glanced up, his eyes weary. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the din of the busy kitchen. "It's just, every day is the same. You work hard, and it feels like no one cares." The simple admission, spoken in a voice of defeated resignation, struck Michael like a blow. Here was a man who had given everything to this job, Yet the price of loyalty was etched into every calloused hand and tired glance. Michael's pen moved swiftly across the page in his notepad, recording the silent tragedy unfolding around him. By mid-afternoon, the restaurant had entered a second wind of activity, the initial rush now a steady, relentless tide. The strain on the employees was evident in every gesture, the way Sarah's smile had faded into a mask of forced politeness, the way Luis's movements had become almost mechanical, and the way even the smallest tasks seemed to drain the life out of them. Rick, ever the harsh overseer, prowled the floor like a predator, his words a constant barrage that belittled anyone in his path. In one particularly jarring moment, a young server named Jake stumbled while carrying a tray of drinks. The tray crashed to the floor, sending glasses shattering and liquid splashing across the tiles. Jake's face went ashen, and before he could utter a word, Rick's booming voice filled the space. "Jake, what the hell is wrong with you? Can't you walk straight?" Rick's sneer was unmistakable as he glared at the trembling young man. "If you're going to mess up, maybe you shouldn't even be here." The reprimand was so severe, so public, that even the customers fell silent, the tension palpable in the air. Jake's eyes filled with tears as he attempted to apologize, his voice lost in the humiliation of the moment. Michael's chest tightened. Every harsh word from Rick not only shattered the confidence of these young workers, but also chipped away at the very foundation of what Carter's Grill and Dine once stood for: a commitment to care, respect, and excellence. Between the bursts of chaotic service and the rare moments of quiet despair, Michael's internal struggle grew. Each incident was a stitch in a tapestry of dysfunction that he could no longer ignore. He had come undercover to witness the true state of his business, and what he saw was a devastating departure from the vision he had nurtured for years. The countless small injustices, the stolen breaks, the callous remarks, the unspoken resignations accumulated into a damning portrait of neglect and apathy. As the afternoon waned, Michael managed to steal a moment away from the frenzy to sit at a quiet corner table. There, with his notepad as his silent confidant, he began to compile his observations. A series of fragmented yet searing vignettes that spoke of a system in decay. He wrote of Sarah's forced smiles and hidden tears, of Luis's silent endurance, and of Jake's trembling fear in the face of relentless scorn. Each note was a promise to himself, a vow that he would not let these stories of struggle go unnoticed. In that reflective pause, Michael's thoughts churned with determination. This is not just a bad day, he thought. It's a cry for help, a sign that our company has lost its way. The realization was bitter, yet it ignited a spark of resolve within him. He would use these painful truths as the catalyst for change, a turning point that would force him to confront the very people responsible for this decay. By the time the shift was drawing to a close, the restaurant's frenetic energy had given way to a heavy, almost palpable exhaustion. The final customers left, and the staff, though physically spent, carried with them the silent burden of another day of unyielding pressure. Michael, still undercover, felt the weight of every glance, every whispered lament, and every harsh word that had filled the day. As the last few employees began tidying up and the lights dimmed over the tired faces of the remaining staff, Michael took one final walk through the now quiet dining area. The vibrant spirit he had once envisioned for Carter's Grill and Dine was buried beneath layers of frustration and neglect. Yet, amid the shadows, there remained a glimmer of hope. A hope that he could still restore the heart of his company if he dared to act. Stepping outside into the cool twilight, Michael paused to catch his breath. The day had been long and grueling, a cascade of moments that left him both heartbroken and resolute. As he looked back at the modest building, its sign now illuminated, against the darkening sky, he knew that the painful truths he had uncovered could not be ignored any longer. In that quiet moment, with the hum of the city in the background, Michael made a silent vow. The system of neglect and abuse would end. He would confront these issues head-on and ensure that every employee, every customer, and every soul within Carter's Grill and Dine was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. With his notepad clutched tightly in hand and a fire burning in his heart, Michael walked away from the restaurant that day. The harrowing experiences of the shift had laid bare the reality he had long feared. A reality where the spirit of his company was being crushed under the weight of indifference. But it was also a reality that, if confronted, could be transformed. Tomorrow, he would return, not just as Mike, the undercover observer, but as Michael Carter, the CEO committed to rebuilding a company that honored its people. The day had been a painful lesson in the cost of complacency, yet it also sparked the first flames of a revolution, one that promised to reclaim the lost soul of Carter's Grill and Dine and restore its legacy of care and excellence. The atmosphere in Carter's Grill and Dine had steadily grown more oppressive as the day wore on. The relentless pace of orders and the unyielding pressure on the staff created a simmering tension that Michael, working undercover as Mike, could no longer ignore. Every whispered complaint and every resigned sigh had piled upon one another until, in that final stretch of the day, the dam of suppressed frustrations was ready to burst. It began subtly. As the mid-afternoon rush settled into a monotonous hum, Michael noticed the once muted glances among the employees had become laden with anxiety. In the cramped break area, tired voices whispered stories of missed meals, of hours unjustly slashed, and of a manager whose cruelty had become a daily torment. Even the customers, who had always been a vibrant part of the dining experience, now seemed to share in an unspoken discomfort that tainted their interactions. Michael could see Sarah, his earlier impression of quiet resilience, begin to crack under the weight of it all. Her forced smile had gradually faded, replaced by an ever-present look of dread. She had been the only beacon of kindness that day, yet the burden of being constantly scrutinized and berated was visibly etched on her delicate features. Each time, Rick, the store manager with his scowl permanently set in place, passed by, Sarah's eyes would flicker with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, as if bracing for the inevitable verbal assault. Then, without warning, the tension exploded. During a busy lunch period, Sarah was tasked with preparing a large order for a group of regulars. The orders were piling up faster than she could manage, and the air was heavy with urgency. As she hurried to grab a tray laden with steaming plates and cups, her hands, already trembling from the constant pressure, betrayed her. The tray slipped from her grasp, and a cacophony of clattering dishes and shattering glass filled the room. For a suspended moment, time seemed to stand still. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on Sarah as she knelt in the middle of the chaos, scrambling to retrieve fallen items. The din of the kitchen and the murmurs of startled customers faded into a haunting silence. In that fragile pause, the entire weight of the day crashed down on her. Before anyone could offer assistance, Rick stormed from the kitchen with his usual aura of unchecked authority. His voice, sharp and unforgiving, cut through the silence. "What is it this time? Can't you do anything right?" he roared, his tone laden with disdain as he stalked towards Sarah. His eyes, cold and unyielding, met hers with a look that seemed to strip away any vestige of dignity. Sarah's voice, barely a whisper, attempted an apology. I'm so sorry," she stuttered, her face flushed with humiliation as tears threatened to spill. "I'll fix it. I promise. I'll clean it up right away." Rick's response was a barrage of bitter words. "Sorry isn't enough, is it? If you can't handle your job, maybe you shouldn't even be here." His words echoed across the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. The harshness of his tone left no room for misunderstanding. Rick was not merely angry about a mistake. He was seething with a deep-seated contempt for what he considered incompetence. In that instant, Michael felt something shift inside him. The quiet observer he had been until now transformed into a man fueled by righteous anger. He could no longer stand idly by as a dedicated employee was publicly humiliated. her spirit crushed under the weight of a manager's relentless tirade. The final straw had been raised. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Michael moved closer, his presence unnoticed by the frenzied staff. He had been taking note all day, each whispered comment, each instance of neglect, and now, as he witnessed the culmination of a system gone awry, he knew that he could no longer remain a passive observer. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah's eyes met Michael's for a brief, heart-wrenching moment. There was silent communication in that look, a mixture of pleading, sorrow, and a glimmer of hope that someone, anyone, might stand up for her. But before she could even process the reassurance, Rick's booming voice slammed the moment into focus again. "Get it together or you're done," Rick bellowed, his voice a final verdict that reverberated in the suddenly hushed room. Michael's internal struggle reached its peak. The faces of the staff, the despair in their eyes, the humiliation and injustice inflicted upon them, they all converged into one undeniable truth. The system was broken. The values upon which Carter's Grill and Dine was built had been eroded by a culture of fear and abuse. And now, Michael, who had once only peered through the lens of an undercover employee, found himself at the precipice of action. He took a deep, steadying breath. The bustling restaurant seemed to fade into a blur as his focus narrowed on the injustice before him. The hurt in Sarah's eyes, the resigned murmurs of his co-workers, and the callous sneer on Rick's face all solidified his resolve. This was not just about one mistake or one humiliating moment. It was about the cumulative suffering of every single employee who had silently borne the brunt of a flawed leadership. With the final customers trickling out and the frenetic pace of the afternoon gradually subsiding, Michael stepped outside for a breath of cool air. The soft hum of the city outside contrasted sharply with the bitter reality he had witnessed. Leaning against the restaurant's doorframe, he closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of the day to settle in his heart. The determination that had taken root within him now burned with an intensity that he knew would not be extinguished until justice was served. In that solitary pause, with the whispers of change stirring in the early evening air, Michael made a silent vow. "I will not let this continue," he promised himself. "I will bring about the change these people deserve, no matter what it takes." The promise was as much for himself as it was for every soul that had suffered silently, behind the counters and in the kitchens of Carter's Grill and Dine. Returning inside, Michael carried with him a newfound resolve. The quiet determination in his eyes was evident even as he resumed his role as Mike, the unassuming employee whose days of silent observation were now behind him. Every task he performed, from restocking shelves to clearing tables, was imbued with the urgency of someone who had witnessed too much pain to remain passive any longer. The day had been a crucible of harsh truths and painful revelations. As Michael walked through the now quieter dining area, the echoes of the day's injustices still resonated in his mind. He knew that the time had come for the next step, a confrontation that would force the corrosive practices of the past into the light. The final straw had been broken, and with it, the door was open for a revolution that promised to restore the dignity and respect that had once been the foundation of Carter's Grill and Dine. With his notepad clutched tightly in hand, and a fire burning in his heart, Michael stepped out of the restaurant that day with a clear, unwavering resolve. The harrowing experiences of the shift had laid bare the painful reality of his company's decline, and he vowed that nothing would remain unchanged. Tomorrow, he would no longer be a silent witness. Tomorrow, he would return, not as Mike, but as Michael Carter, the CEO determined to reclaim the heart and soul of his beloved company. In that decisive moment, as twilight embraced the city, Michael Carter understood that the breaking point was not an end, but the beginning of a necessary transformation. A transformation fueled by truth, accountability, and an unyielding commitment to the people who had suffered in silence for far too long. The tension inside Carter's Grill and Dine had reached its peak. The air was thick with an unspoken heaviness, the kind that settled after a storm, But before the full consequences had been realized, Michael Carter, still disguised as Mike, stood in the midst of it all, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He had seen enough. He had heard enough. The mistreatment of his employees, the toxic leadership, the blatant disregard for human dignity. It had all reached a point where silence was no longer an option. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. It was time. Rick, the so-called manager, still carried himself with arrogant authority, completely unaware that his reign was about to come crashing down. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee like he hadn't just humiliated one of his hardest-working employees in front of a crowd. The other employees, including Sarah and Luis, moved around the restaurant like ghosts, their expressions blank, their movements mechanical. This was their life, pushing through the abuse, trying to survive another shift, but not today. Michael adjusted his glasses and stepped forward, his hands tightening into fists before he forced himself to relax. He needed to handle this carefully. He wasn't just here to make a scene. He was here to change everything. Rick, let's talk in the office. Rick barely looked at him, scoffing as he took another sip of coffee. Talk? About what? You screwed something up already? Michael didn't flinch. His voice remained steady. No, but we need to talk. Now. The firmness in his tone made a few employees glance up. Rick frowned as if realizing for the first time that there was something different about the man standing before him. Still, he rolled his eyes and pushed off the counter. Fine, let's get this over with. Michael followed Rick into the small back office, the door clicking shut behind them. The walls were lined with outdated paperwork, dusty files, and schedules that dictated the overworked lives of the staff outside. Rick slumped into his chair, not bothering to offer Michael a seat. Make it quick, Rick said, barely suppressing his annoyance. I don't have time for this. Michael slowly removed his glasses and cap. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. His sharp blue eyes, once hidden, now met Rick's with an intensity that sent a visible shiver of confusion through the manager. Michael took his time, letting the moment settle. Then, finally, he spoke. I'm Michael Carter. I own this company. The color drained from Rick's face. He blinked, then let out a forced, humorless laugh. Very funny. You expect me to believe that? Michael didn't waver. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his company ID. His real ID. The name, Michael Carter, was printed clearly beneath his photo. The same name Rick had probably seen 100 times on memos, training, materials, and corporate policies. Policies he had clearly ignored. Rick's smirk vanished. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but powerful. Now you understand why I'm here. Rick swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for an escape. Listen, Mr. Carter. Stop. Michael's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. You've already said enough. I've been here all day. I've seen how you treat the employees, how you speak to customers, how you run this restaurant. I've watched you belittle and break down the very people who keep this place running. In that moment, the weight of his dual identity pressed on him. The CEO who had built a legacy, and the Mike who now felt the sting of its decay. He reached into his pocket and clutched the notepad that had recorded the day's tragedies. Each scribbled note was a testament to the pain and neglect that had festered in the corridors of Carter's Grill and Dine. With every written word, his determination grew stronger. The cacophony of the restaurant resumed, but Michael's mind was clear. He could not let this day end without taking a stand. As the final echoes of Rick's harsh words began to dissipate, Michael moved with purpose. He sought out Sarah, who was quietly attempting to collect the remnants of the shattered tray, her hands still trembling with residual shock. Sarah, Michael said softly, his voice laden with concern and determination. She looked up, startled, her eyes searching his face for answers. But in that moment, before any explanation could be given, a spark of defiance ignited in Michael's heart. He could no longer be a silent witness. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the remnants of the chaos. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm yet resonant, carrying an authority that cut through the din. The room seemed to pause, every eye turning towards him as if drawn by the unexpected force of his presence. For a moment, silence reigned, an interlude in which the accumulated tension seemed to hang palpably in the air. Then, as if in response to a silent command, whispers of disbelief and cautious hope rippled among the gathered staff. Michael's words had struck a chord of truth that resonated with the deepest wounds of their daily existence. In that charged silence, Michael's mind raced with the enormity of what needed to be done. The humiliation of a hard-working employee could no longer be justified by misplaced efficiency, and the fear that had become the norm in this establishment had to be eradicated. Every instance of cruelty, every word of disparagement demanded retribution. But more than that, they demanded change. A change that had to begin with accountability. The anger that had been simmering within Michael reached a crescendo. Every whispered complaint, every tear hidden behind forced smiles, coalesced into a single, unyielding resolve. He would no longer allow the system to treat his employees as expendable pawns in the pursuit of profit. Today, the status quo would be shattered, and the foundations of Carter's Grill and Dine would be re-examined. As the shift continued around him, Michael's gaze met the eyes of his co-workers, those tired souls who had endured one injustice after another. There was a silent, collective acknowledgement that something needed to change. The day had exposed the raw nerve of a broken system, and Michael knew that he was now the catalyst for the transformation that his company so desperately needed. In the midst of the returning clamour, as Rick resumed his patrol with a grim determination, and the staff tried to salvage the remnants of their shattered composure, Michael retreated for a brief moment to a quiet corner of the restaurant. There, he reviewed the damning evidence of the day, hastily scribbled notes, overheard laments, and the silent testimonies etched on the faces of those who had suffered. Each piece of evidence reinforced his growing conviction that the time for passive observation was over. Rick's fingers twitched on the desk. I was just keeping order, making sure things run smoothly. It's a tough job, you know." Michael narrowed his eyes. Tough? A tough job doesn't give you the right to humiliate hardworking people. A tough job doesn't justify cutting people's hours unfairly or refusing to give them breaks. A tough job doesn't mean you ignore injuries in the kitchen, insult elderly customers, and push good employees to the brink. Rick's breath came fast, his once overpowering presence now shrinking beneath Michael's glare. "You're fired," the words hung in the air like a hammer waiting to fall. Rick jolted upright. "Wait, hold on." Michael stood, his tone unwavering. "You will pack your things and leave this restaurant immediately. Security will escort you out if necessary." Rick sputtered, looking around as if the dingy office walls might offer him a way out. "You can't just—" "I can. And I just did." Michael turned, not waiting for another excuse. He swung the door open and stepped out into the restaurant, where nearly every employee had stopped what they were doing. They had heard the conversation, they had seen Rick's stunned, paling face, and they had hope in their eyes. Michael let out a breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just here to remove one toxic manager, he was here to fix everything. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I know today has been difficult, and I know this isn't the first time you felt overworked, underappreciated, or disrespected." Silence. Some employees exchanged nervous glances, still unsure what to believe. But that ends today. Michael looked around the room, meeting each gaze with sincerity. Rick is gone. He should never have been in charge. And moving forward, this restaurant and this company will be different. Sarah, who had been standing frozen behind the counter, covered her mouth with her hand, blinking rapidly as if she might wake up from a dream. Luis, standing near the grill, exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Others straightened their backs for the first time that day, as if shaking off an invisible weight they had carried for far too long. Michael continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Starting immediately, we are making changes. Sarah, I've seen how hard you work. You're getting a raise and a promotion. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Me? Michael nodded. Yes, and Luis, you and the other kitchen staff will have better scheduling and breaks. No more working back-to-back shifts without rest. Luis nodded, a mix of relief and gratitude flashing across his face. Michael wasn't done. I'll be personally reviewing policies across all locations. We're implementing an anonymous employee feedback system so that no one will ever feel like they can't speak up. Management will be trained properly. And if anyone treats an employee with the kind of disrespect I saw today, they will be gone. No exceptions. The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a murmur of disbelief and gratitude spread through the employees. It was happening. Real change. A customer, an elderly woman sitting near the entrance, the same one Rick had disrespected earlier, clapped her hands together softly. Then another customer followed, and then another. Soon, the entire restaurant erupted in quiet applause, a moment of shared understanding between the employees and the customers who had witnessed everything that day. Michael felt something in his chest loosen, a tight knot of guilt, disappointment, and regret that had been building for years. He had finally done what should have been done long ago, and this was just the beginning.